Over the past 2.5 months in our impact groups, we've been answering the question, what does it mean to be a disciple? We could continue to do that for another 3 or 4 months. We're going to conclude the conversation today. When Jesus came, he came to save us, of course, but he also came to call us to participate in the work he's doing in our generation. And so disciples are people who join Jesus in the work that he's doing. So we'll conclude that conversation today. As we pick back up our impact groups on the other side of Christmas, we'll talk about spiritual gifts next year. All right, I know everybody's got Christmas on your mind. At least I think you do. I have it on my mind. I've got to get out and do some shopping, and it's a fun time of year. I'm so glad you guys are together and forming the relationships, and I've just felt really good about how the impact groups have gotten started. Thank you so much to all of you who are leading and hosting and participating, and just really makes me happy to know you guys are out here having these kind of biblical conversations with each other. Over this period of time where we've been talking about discipleship, we've covered a lot of ground, and it's been very good. It's been very good for me and my group to have these conversations. So what I want to do today to wrap it up is I want to walk through remind you of some of the biggest points about being a disciple. And then on the back half, I want to teach something about disciples that we actually haven't covered yet, okay? So I just want to kind of go through 4 points, and each of these could ideally be good conversation points in a few minutes. And the first one is this, where does discipleship start? Well, it starts with the calling. It all begins when Jesus calls us, and we see him in the Gospels use this phrase with Matthew and others. He says, hey, come follow me. And it's that simple. To get started as a disciple, we receive the invitation and we come and we follow him. And so then we study Jesus and with his disciples and how he grew them and how he shaped them into mature disciples who could go out and do ministry on their own. And so we see the pattern. It's a pattern that's easy to see when you look at Scripture. At first, Jesus says, listen, just come follow me and watch what I'm doing. And Jesus does the ministry. He does the teaching. They're part of the crowd. The disciples are, and they're just amazed at him, and they watch him do ministry. And then one day, the amazing thing happens, and I'll just use the example of the feeding of the 5,000, because here they are, they're ready for Jesus to do his thing again. But this time, Jesus looks at the disciples and he says, hey, I want you guys to participate. And I think what he was saying is, you guys are ready for the next step in discipleship. No longer are you just going to watch me do ministry, but now you're going to participate with me. And so he invites them into that miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. And then sometime later, Jesus actually sends them out 2 by 2. There's the account in the Gospel of Luke where he says, listen, he didn't say this, but it's what happened. He said, I'm not going with you. Jesus, physically, I'm not going to go with you. You're going to go out 2 by 2 to the towns and villages, and you're going to do the ministry. You're going to heal. You're going to cast out demons. You're going to present the gospel. And then when they came back, he coached them. So one of the principles about being a disciple is understanding it's a process, and God and Jesus are growing all of us over time to be more effective and to be more like him. So that's kind of the first principle, is the call. The second principle is the goal. What ultimately is the goal of a disciple? Well, Jewish culture and the Bible are very clear. The goal of a disciple is to be like the rabbi. So for us, it's to be like Jesus. And Jesus said this in Luke 6, verse 40. He said, a disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. So really simple, but we can talk about that more in the group. What does it mean to look like Jesus? But then there's another element to discipleship that we covered, and I would call this the cost. We have the call of being a disciple. We have the goal of discipleship. What about the cost of being a disciple? Well, Jesus doesn't go easy on us here. Jesus says this in Luke 14:27. He says, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. The reality of being a disciple of Jesus is that we orient our entire lives around him and his mission. And then the last one, by way of review, would be the result. What is the end result of the life of a mature disciple? And the end result is fruit. It's fruit. We bear fruit unto the kingdom. So John 15:5, we read this. Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. So each of those components we can review and discuss more. This idea of bearing fruit, ultimately that's what it's all about. You know, it's God's interested in fruit, the fruit of the kingdom, the fruit of the Spirit, and the fruit of salvation. So we get to participate that as disciples. He invites us in. Now, the last part that I have not taught in the midst of our impact groups, and some of you may be aware of this or may not, but I want to go to the culture of Jesus' day so we really more thoroughly understand what it meant for these men to be called by Jesus to be his disciples. And there's some instruction here for us, some good insight for us to get. So here's the Jewish culture in Jesus' day in terms of education. Education, by the way, was all about the Bible. It was biblical education. So at the age of 5 or maybe 6 years old, the kids would start to learn. They would go to what was called Bet Sefer. That was like their elementary school. And what they did was they studied to memorize the Torah. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And they would memorize those 5 books over a period of years. They would go to school week in, week out, and spend time with the Torah studying. And then, the Mishnah, we get a lot of this information from the Mishnah, which records a lot of the history around the time of Jesus in Jewish culture. Somewhere around 12 or 13 years old, some of them would move on to this format where they would start to more rigorously study Scripture, debate Scripture. And so they would do it through question and answer. They would have a question and answer format with their teachers. They would have discussion. They would have debate to really get to the heart of what Scripture was talking about. And it's interesting, I think we see an element of that in Jesus when he went to Jerusalem with his parents when he was a young boy and they lost him. Remember, they left. They had to come back and find him. And they found him in the temple, and he was debating and questioning and answering with the leaders there at the temple. So that would be consistent with the culture of the day. And then from there, the best students, they would be looking for the best students. And the best students would go on from there to have even deeper study throughout the rest of the Old Testament Scripture. And they would really seek for an understanding and how it was to be applied. Now, all of that is the background. And by the way, Jesus would have gone through that system. The disciples would have gone through that system according to history and the way the culture handled it. Now listen, the very best out of Bet Midrash, that second school, would have the opportunity to go on and be Talmidim or Talmud. Talmidim is the word for disciples. A Talmud would be an individual disciple. And the best of the best would have the opportunity to follow a rabbi. And the way it typically went was the student would go to the rabbi and ask if he could follow that rabbi. And typically the rabbi would have one of 2 answers. He would either say, "Come follow me," or he would say, "Go home and ply your trade." In other words, if you weren't going to be able to be a disciple of a rabbi, you would then go and be a part of the family business or the local town, and you would ply your trade. Now, it's interesting that Jesus didn't do it that way. Jesus actually went to the disciples. And who did he go to? Well, he went to fishermen. He went to people who are already plying their trade. You know what that means? Probably, I see it in Scripture when you look at history. Most likely, these guys that Jesus ended up picking, Peter, James, John, the others, they failed in a sense. That might be too strong to say it that way, but they weren't maybe the best of the best out of Beit Midrash. They weren't the top ones that the rabbis were looking for to follow them. They had kind of been passed over. And yet Jesus came to them and he called them and said, "Come and be my disciples. Come, follow me." And I get encouraged by that because Jesus comes to us today. Not many are of high, noble standing. We're ordinary people. And yet Jesus comes and he calls us. And then when you follow that rabbi, you then want to be like him. Listen, when you follow a rabbi in Jewish culture, you're not trying to understand the rabbi's teaching. It's not like, hey, now I know what this guy's saying, he's a good teacher or whatever. You're not trying to simply understand what he's teaching. You don't want to know what he said as much as you want to know why he said it. You wanted to be able to crawl inside the mind and the life of the rabbi so that you know everything about him. You know what he's thinking about while he's saying what it is that he's saying. When you follow a rabbi, you don't just go in the same direction as the rabbi. You literally want to step in the very places where he steps. You take your following of the rabbi that serious. That's why Peter, I know we've covered this before, that's why Peter walked on the water. Peter walked on the water because his rabbi was walking on the water, and he wanted to walk as his rabbi walked. So as I kind of wrap up this idea of discipleship, and it's going to feed us into our series as we start out next year, discipleship isn't ultimately about learning the teaching as much as it is applying it and living it out. What it means to be a disciple of Jesus is to live out his calling, to live in a manner worthy of the calling, and to accomplish the mission that he's called us to. And that's what spiritual gifts are all about, and that's what we'll jump into early next year. So God bless you guys. Have a fantastic week heading into Christmas. Be safe, and I pray and hope that your Christmas is special in every way. God bless you guys.